Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and as you heard, I have two titles to my name. I am a PhD, but also a rabbi, and so in keeping with good clergy form, you know, before I speak, I have something to say. So I'd like to begin, first of all, with all my heart to say I've been looking forward so much to being here at Cal State. This is my first visit to this campus, but I've heard about it from Rabbi Cohn, and when I was called by Dean Mohammed to come and speak, especially following the speaker last year, the chancellor of our college, Rabbi Ellenson, I couldn't really wait to get here, and so to top it all off was to do something in the name of Rabbi Cohn, who I've known my entire career, and I am so glad he told you some stories about Dr. Marcus, the founder of the American Jewish Archives, who lived to be about 100, by the way, and everywhere I go, people who studied with him remember him and have these wonderful memories and treasure thought of him. And I'd like to say, Hillel, to you and Rita both, I don't think it's an exaggeration that Dr. Marcus would have been so very proud of the career that the two of you made here in Southern California, the kinds of accolades that have been heaped upon you, the good work you've done for the benefit of all humankind. And it's just a wonderful honor for me to be here and to speak here at this school, this fine school, in a lectureship named after you. I would also be remiss if I didn't recognize and acknowledge the presence of President Morales, that the president of the college and the university would come to such a talk is obviously bespeaks the importance of this Rabbi Hillel Cohn lectureship. I want to also thank my friend Dean Mohammed, who was the first person to call me and has welcomed me in every possible way, to the development team, and even to the technology folks who are jerry-rigging everything so that it hopefully will work tonight somewhat. I'm very grateful to one and all. I would want to, you know, I know that the main idea of this lectureship was to bring something of contemporary relevance. And I'm going to come at it from a somewhat of a different point of view, because what I'm going to try to do is explain ultimately why, well, here's a way of putting it. The book that I've written that came out a year and a half ago on Abraham Lincoln and American Jewry ends with the movie that appeared in 2014 or 2013 that was produced by Steven Spielberg. Lincoln, Donald Day O'Connor played the lead of Lincoln, and the question that one could ask contemporarily is, why, of all the people who could have produced a film on Lincoln that focused on the 13th Amendment and the doing away permanently of slavery, why would that have been produced by Spielberg and written by the very prominent Jewish playwright that is the screenplay by Tony Kushner? And in a way, my talk is an attempt to explain how that comes to be. So let's begin with a little music. You've all been waiting a long time, and hopefully we'll pick this up. Let's see if it works. Start from the first slide, if you would. There you go. Okay, now hit the second slide. See if it'll work. There you go.
We are calling Father Abram, 300,000 more, from Mississippi's winding stream and from New England shore. We leave our plows and workshops, our wives and children dear, with hearts to full of utterance, with but a silent tear. We dare not look behind us, but steadfastly before. We are coming, Father Abram, with 300,000 more. We are coming,
Great. Now, that song the words were written by the man on your left, James Sloan Gibbons, who was an abolitionist. And he wrote those words when Lincoln in 1862 called for additional recruits because the Civil War started out with the idea that this would be a cakewalk for the Union. And by 1862, it was clear that that was not going to be the case. And so Lincoln calls for several 100,000 more soldiers. And this poem, written by an abolitionist, was put to music by a number of different composers, and the tune that I wanted to play for you this evening was written by the famous American composer Stephen Foster. The question is this. The title of my book is We Called Him Rabbi Abraham. It's not a title that I made up out of whole cloth. That's from a document. And the question for tonight is, how did it happen that the whole nation, when they heard that song and that poem, began to refer to Abraham Lincoln as Father Abraham, sort of tongue-in-cheek, likening him to the biblical figure Abraham? How did it come to be that the title of my book would be, We Called Him Rabbi Abraham? So to answer this question, let me begin our excursion this evening by introducing you to a wonderful book that I'd recommend to the students here. It's a light read. It's not a big history book, but it's something you could read on vacation and enjoy. It's a book by a freelance writer by the name of Andrew Ferguson. He writes for magazines out on the East and as a special correspondent, and he did a book in 2007 called Land of Lincoln, and in this book he travels all about looking for interesting sites in America that have to do with Abraham Lincoln. So he goes to Springfield, and he goes to the museum there, and then he goes to the home of some very eccentric collector of Lincolnalia, and he makes all sorts of interesting stops, but the most interesting stop he makes has to do in one chapter where he goes to visit this place, which is the Thai Little Home Cafe. I don't know if it still exists, but it certainly did in 2009 and 10 when I made this slide. And this little cafe was started in the early 70s by immigrants from Thailand, the Eshe family. And the Eshe family came here as young parents. They had 2 little children. They already knew about Lincoln. They move into the west side of Chicago. They open up this restaurant, and at some point they take their children down to Springfield, Illinois, where they show their children the Lincoln homestead and Lincoln tomb and so forth. And like so many other people, they come back with a bust of Abraham Lincoln. That's what many people do after they've been down there. They buy a souvenir, and not probably knowing exactly what to do with it, they decided to put it into their restaurant by the cash register, and there it sits. And lo and behold, according to Mr. Eshe, it's at this point that his restaurant really takes off. And he starts to be a very successful entrepreneur. And he and his wife according to Ferguson, credit Abraham Lincoln for this success. And in keeping with that religious tradition, they bring out a meal, because Lincoln is in a way a demigod. They bring out a meal and they serve the president a different meal every night. And this is what brought Ferguson to Wicker Park, Illinois. Now I'm going to quote to you directly from Ferguson's book. What I'm about to read is right from Ferguson's book. Ferguson has now asked them about the meal, and this is what Mr. Eshe, the immigrant, says. He says, "It's a full meal, everything, entree, dessert, appetizer, drink also. We change the meal every day so that it's always different. We serve him everything." Then Mrs. Eshe interrupted. "Well, everything but no pork." "Oh?" Mrs. Eshe says, "Well, we don't want to be disrespectful." I guess Mr. Eshe saw the puzzled look on my face. He said, "Well, he is Abraham Lincoln, yes," with special emphasis, "and Jewish people don't eat pork." Now, with all due respect to Mr. Esche, and by the way, to countless American Jews today who are convinced that Abraham Lincoln somehow or another is literally of Jewish descent, I am sad to have to break the news to those people that, having studied this topic in great depth, legally speaking, according to Jewish law, there is no possible way that Abraham Lincoln could be a descendant of Hebrews. Certainly, at the very least, it is impossible to be able to document that. On the other hand, from the time of Lincoln's presidency up until the present day, American Jews feel a very unique bond with a man that, as I already said, contemporaries were calling Father Abraham. Not only have American Jews venerated this man, but what I found in my research is that something very unique happens. They try hard to, if you will, Judaize Abraham Lincoln. And the Judaization of Abraham Lincoln is something that begins while he's president and continues on to this day. Why did this happen is the purpose of my talk to you, and I'm going to try to explain several reasons why this came about. We have to begin by looking at my hometown, where I woke up this morning in Cincinnati, Ohio. You're looking at what we call today the Midwest. In those days, called the Old Northwest. And if you all think about what this part of the country looked like in 1809 population-wise, when Lincoln was just born, you would have to say that it was a real frontier. There were no major urban cities. Now, if you skip ahead 40 years, when Lincoln's starting to ascend and become an important political figure in Illinois, believe it or not, 1/4 of the United States population lives in this region. And of that large percentage, about 85%, it's been estimated by demographic scholars, are people who were immigrants, people who had come to the frontier but were born somewhere overseas, mostly from what we would call the German states, also from some of the Baltic states and so forth, and of course Irish as well. And so Abraham Lincoln grows up in a part of this country at a time when, if he hoped to be elected on a statewide basis, he had to be accustomed to hearing accents. He had to be accustomed to understanding that there were people who had different backgrounds than he did. And he had to be ready to reach out to them. And this is clear from our documentary evidence that with regard to American Jews who were just starting to grow in numbers, most of these Jews had come over with the German migration that filled up America and filled up this part of the country. And this is just a chart that appears in a book of all the connections to Jews that Lincoln had even before becoming president and as he ascends to the presidency. If you look at this chart, it's no exaggeration to say that Abraham Lincoln had bonds and connections with more Jewish people than all 15 presidents who preceded him together. Now, just knowing a Jew is not a great accomplishment, but having a relationship and a friendship with Jews, well, that's rather unusual in those days and with people of political prominence in that part of the world. So let me show you some examples of how it came to be that, first of all, we know how many Jews Lincoln knew. This is Lincoln's home in Springfield, and as you know, he moves to Springfield. It becomes his adopted home in the 1840s, and he becomes Springfield's most famous citizen. And it's in the late 1840s, early 1850s, that Jews actually start to move into Springfield at the very same time that Lincoln moves to Springfield. And by the early 1850s, the congregation that still exists in Springfield is established. And we have documentary evidence, I'm going to show you a little of it, that shows that Lincoln knew these people. Not only did he know them, if they were owners of shops or stores, he did business with them. And even more significantly, he not only patronized their businesses, but in many instances, we know he was a friend. Take a look at this man. This is Mr. Hammerslau. Hammerslau was a Bavarian Jew who comes to Springfield. He opens up a clothing store. He's a haberdasher. And we know from documentary evidence, he's, by the way, one of the founders of the congregation in Springfield. We know that Lincoln buys his suits from Hammerslau's haberdashery. That's nice, but what we also know is that when Lincoln is elected president, Mary Lincoln, his wife, invites the Hammerslau family to accompany her family to Washington, D.C. as their escort and to attend the inauguration. I think it's fair to say that that would be a fair amount of historical proof that Mr. Hammerslau was not just the salesman for those suits we see in the pictures, but rather he was someone that the family felt close enough to, he and his wife, that they wanted to invite him to come along with her family to Washington. Now, here's a little letter having to do with another Jew that Lincoln met probably on the 8th Circuit when he was traveling around Illinois for so many years as a lawyer. In Jacksonville, Illinois, there was a Jew by the name of Henry Rice, and we know he owned a general goods store in Jacksonville. Now, you're looking at an actual Abraham Lincoln letter, and as you can see with your own eyes, he starts out by saying, General McClellan, now McClellan is the general-in-chief, would like to appoint Henry Rice to be a sutler. Now, does anybody happen to know what a sutler is? Because otherwise you can't really appreciate. Yes, sir?
A store.
Yes, but a special kind of store in a sense. Well, what it is he is given the patronage of being able to sell goods, various kinds of goods, to the military. That's sort of like being the military printer or the government printer. It's an income that comes to you that is pretty regular and is good for business. Now, I think it's logical. We can assume that if the general-in-chief, McClellan, wanted to have Henry Rice to get a sutler button, he probably could have done that himself. So what's going on here is I think we can assume that Abraham Lincoln wants his old friend that he knew from his trips to Jacksonville, wants to do a little favor for him, but he doesn't want to pin it on himself. So he says, well, it's General McClellan who wants him to become a sutler. And in fact, for a year and a half, Rice does have that sutler button, and I'm sure it was very beneficial to him. This picture I took by myself with my own Samsung phone. I hope you can see it. I was so happy to meet this guy. If you can make out the gravestone, it says Louis Salzenstein. And I had read and studied all about Louis Salzenstein, and there I was standing at his grave in the Springfield Cemetery, right where the president is buried, nearby. Salzenstein worked his whole life in a nearby city called Athens, Illinois. Most people would incorrectly pronounce that Athens, Illinois, but if you're an Illini, you know the correct pronunciation, of course, is Athens, Illinois. And Salzenstein was the proprietor of this store called the Rogers Building, which still stands in Athens, Illinois. And this was the post office when Abraham Lincoln, in his very first political appointment, was the postmaster general of this area. This is where the post office was. So Lincoln would, on his way back to Springfield, stop in Athens. And when Louis Salzenstein, who, by the way, was known in Athens as Old Salty, when he would stop by, Lincoln would stop by to, if you'll forgive me, schmooze. That's Latin for kibitz, which is Greek for joke around with Old Salty. And Salty, if you go home today, and I'm now speaking to the students, and You look up Salzenstein, Salzenstein. If you look that up, you look up Athens, spelled Athens, and you put Lincoln in, you'll see that to this day, there's a little, if you will, museum, a tiny little museum with memorabilia in Athens, Illinois, that says, Abraham Lincoln slept here, and this is something that Abraham Lincoln touched, and so forth. So, I really love that piece of Abraham Lincoln. When our first presidents, Adams and Jefferson and Washington, you have to go all up and down the East Coast to the fancy cities. What they slept here. You want to see where Abraham Lincoln slept, you got to go to Athens, Illinois. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Jonas Boys. Wrong slide. These are the Jonas Boys that I want to talk to you about. You're looking at Joseph Jonas and Abraham Jonas. Joseph Jonas, by the way, was a very famous Jew. He's known in the literature as the first Jew to come to Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, he was not the first Jew to come to Cincinnati, Ohio. We know that now from documentary evidence there were other Jews who beat him there, but he lived to be a very old man and outlived all of his contemporaries, and that should be a lesson for all of us. If we outlive anyone who can deny what we say, we can sort of fashion our history the way we want. But Jonas brought his brother, Abraham, to Cincinnati. They marry two young women. Tragically, these two young women pass away from some kind of probably disease that could be easily cured by penicillin today, a bacterial disease of some sort. They die in their 20s. And Joseph Jonas remains in Cincinnati, becomes a very prominent citizen in Cincinnati. His brother apparently didn't like it and went to live in Kentucky for a little bit. And then in 1838, Abraham Jonas will move to a place in Illinois called Quincy, Illinois. And in Quincy, Illinois, he settles down and wants to study to be a lawyer. And he likes to meet with other young lawyers who are his age and who are just starting out in this field. And so Abraham Jonas meets another Abraham in Quincy, Illinois on this circuit in the year 1838. And these two Abrahams become very good friends. Now, I have a whole chapter on the Jonas-Lincoln relationship, and all I can tell you about this in the time that I have is that this was not just a friendship like the others that I've mentioned. This was really a political alliance. These two people were in the Whig Party together. They had a similar point of view in terms of slavery and so forth, and then in the 1850s they are pioneer founders of the Republican Party, and there is no question, if you read all the documents, and this is in standard American literature relating to the strategy being used to get Lincoln the nomination in 1860, that this man Jonas played a very important role in helping Lincoln to become president and in other ways. They were very close friends, and to demonstrate that, I bring this document. I've underlined an important line. This is a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote to Abraham Jonas, and he wanted to present Mr. Jonas with a book of speeches that he had published. And in the letter that goes along with it, Lincoln says, see, as you can see for yourself, since you are one of my most valued friends. People who study Lincoln know that he hesitated. He was always hesitant to be a baloney bender, to exaggerate, to say things that just were blatantly not true. The idea that he would say that Jonas was really his close friend is probably the truth. So I've now demonstrated for you that Abraham Lincoln not only patronized Jewish stores, he had a lot of connections through his travels. He also had political alliances and friendships and so forth. Now what I want to do is quickly try to demonstrate that Lincoln evidently had a certain personality that helped him to endear himself to people who were different than he was. And I'm sure this could be demonstrated with lots of people. A good case could be made at the way in which he interacts with Frederick Douglass, which has been documented in many ways. But my job is to focus on his ability to relate to Jews. So here's a funny story that kind of illuminates this. You're looking at a portrait of a man by the name of Samuel Altschuler. Altschuler was a Bavarian Jew who comes to Urbana in the year 1850, 1851, and he sets up a photography shop in Urbana. And in 1857, the famous Abraham Lincoln, who is hoping to become senator from the state of Illinois, is in Urbana on business, and Altschuler says to himself, if I could take a picture of this man and put it into my window, that would be very good for business. So he approaches Lincoln, he asks Lincoln. Lincoln doesn't know him at all, he's a complete stranger, and Lincoln says, okay. And Lincoln shows up at the store with a colleague later in the day, and Mr. Altschuler is very disappointed that Lincoln is wearing a white, crumpled half coat. So, not wanting to lose the opportunity, the very industrious Mr. Altschuler says, would Mr. Lincoln be willing to go back to his hotel and get his dark coat for the picture? It'll look better if you wear a dark coat. And Lincoln says, I didn't bring my dark coat with me on this trip. I don't have it. So now Altschuler is down to the wire, and he says, well, would Mr. Lincoln be willing to wear my coat? Says, okay. And it didn't occur to either of these men, apparently, according to the way the story has been documented, that they should have stopped to think that Abraham Lincoln was 6'4", and Mr. Altschuler was 5'4". So this drawing here is a recreation. The man in the middle is the man who accompanied them and later would document this story and talk about it in his own reminiscences, a lawyer by the name of Cunningham. And he says that when Lincoln put on Altschuler's coat, all you could see was Lincoln's long white coat sleeves. And Lincoln thought this was very humorous, and he couldn't stop laughing. And this is not good for taking a picture, which for the students explains why the 19th century people always look so somber in these old photographs. It's not because they were not told to smile. Well, they were told not to smile because you would blur the picture. They had to sit still. So laughing was not going to be very good for the picture. And the story goes on. I could carry on. I mean, Cunningham says every single time Altschuler went underneath the curtain, Lincoln burst out into laughter again. And then he says, he makes this poor immigrant tell him a joke. He says, tell me a joke, I'll laugh and get it out of my system. This goes on and on. He's there for, evidently, according to Cunningham, close to an hour. And this is the famous picture that was actually snapped at that occasion. It's the last picture taken before he starts to grow a beard. And there are people who say if you look carefully at the corner of Lincoln's lips, you can see that he's pursing his lips together in an attempt not to laugh. Well, I'll leave that up to you whether you think that's the case or not. But according to Cunningham, he bursts into laughter immediately after this picture is taken. The point of this is Lincoln has nothing to gain by letting a complete stranger take his picture. In those days, the only way most of Americans would know a candidate was through a photograph that might appear in a paper. And many didn't ever know what a candidate looked like. So to entrust your image to a complete stranger, I think, as a historian, says something about the nature of the human being, that he has an ability to be winning with other people. Here's an even more compelling example. You're looking at a Jew by the name of Abraham Cohn. Cohn was, in 1860, the past president of the first Hebrew congregation founded in Chicago, Illinois, a congregation called Kehilath Anshe Mariv, and that's the people of the West. And more importantly, Mr. Cohn was, at that time in 1860, the sitting city clerk of Chicago, and a Democrat. So he is introduced to Lincoln before Lincoln goes to be inaugurated, but after his election. And he meets him, and Lincoln apparently makes it his business to win over this Democratic local figure to be a friend. So what is it that they talk about? According to Mr. Cohen's daughter, they talk about the Hebrew Bible. what Lincoln would probably call the Old Testament. And they discuss it. Lincoln read the Bible, like he read a select number of books. And in February of 1861, a present appears in Springfield, along with many, many other presents that were sent to Lincoln that would go with Lincoln to Washington, D.C. when he was inaugurated. And this is a colorized version of what was sent. It was created by Mr. Cohn, and as you could see, it's an American flag with Hebrew writing on the bars and the stripes. This Hebrew writing is a quotation from the book of Joshua, the opening verses, and as you can all see, although it was written in Hebrew script, I put the translation up there for you. Mr. Cohn says to Lincoln, "Be strong and courageous, be not afraid nor dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Is this something the two of them discussed? Is this a prayer from Mr. Cohn for Lincoln as he heads off on what Lincoln himself says is going to be a very ominous presidency? It's impossible to know. But what's clear here is that through this conversation, a man from a different political party and a different background, Lincoln has somehow the ability to reach out and make him a friend. Now, it's possible that Lincoln's familiarity with American Jews, that he knew so many, and that he had this personality that I've just described, may have influenced Lincoln and shaped his attitude towards Jews. They were not complete strangers to him, and that may have been to their good luck during his presidency, because there were three very, very remarkable events that occurred during Lincoln's presidency that they became national events. And these national events related to Jews, and Lincoln's resolution of these three famous events is attributes in a good part to why Lincoln becomes almost a demigod to the Jews. So the first incident, this is actually, I forgot to tell you, forgive me, the reason I know the flag exists, even though it doesn't exist anymore, the reason we know it actually did exist is evidently a glass negative was taken of the flag, and that's this negative. That it is in the museum in Chicago called Spertus, and that's the only residual we have of it, but you can see the colorization was made from this. And there at the bottom is written by the family of Cohns. This is a picture of the flag that Abraham Cohn made for Abraham Lincoln. Going on, the first incident that occurs in the year 1861 has to do with chaplaincy. You see, when Congress votes to permit soldiers to be recruited into the Union Army to fight the rebellion after April of 1861, the commanders of these brigades are given the permission to appoint religious chaplains for the military. The only problem is that in the bill itself, it says that only those who are of Christian denomination can serve in the United States military. This is very problematic because Jews had already begun to enlist in the Union Army and were serving, and even more problematic is there were Jews in the Confederacy, and in the Confederacy there was no problem for their religious leaders. And so all of this was upsetting to the Jewish community in the North, and so the Jewish community sends this man. His name is Rabbi Abraham Feschel. They send him down to Washington, D.C., and their goal is to get Lincoln by executive action to change the rule and make it possible for Jews to become chaplains in the military. Now, Lincoln listens to him very carefully in December of 1861, and he says, "Come back tomorrow and I'll give you my decision." When he comes back tomorrow, Lincoln won't see him. So Mr. Rabbi Feschel is a little upset. He doesn't know what happens. He comes back another time. Lincoln won't see him. So he's convinced Lincoln is going to do nothing for him. He goes back to his hotel, and he's writing every day to the people who sponsored his trip to Washington, D.C., trying to figure out, should I stay, should I go, what should I do? And then comes evidently a telegram to his room in the Willard Hotel. And although the telegram itself is no longer in existence, fortunately, the neurotic rabbi must have sat down immediately and written exactly what the telegram said and sent it off to his sponsors, and so the message of the telegram has survived. And as you can see for yourself, Lincoln apparently writes to him and says, I've thought this over, and what I want to do is have Congress change the whole law so that it will be possible for Jews to serve as military chaplains. Now, it happens within 4.5 months, and in my book I document how Lincoln actually works Congress. This, you would think in our day and age that this would be a no-brainer, something very simple to accomplish, but there was bitter opposition to any attempt to place anyone other than an ordained Christian minister in the position of a military chaplain, and Lincoln had to press and twist arms behind the scenes. He was very careful to do this in an unobtrusive way, and in 4.5 months, Congress does revisit the bill and changes the law, and it's Abraham Lincoln who will be the first president in U.S. history to appoint a Jew to serve as military chaplain in the United States. This is noted in all the Jewish papers. It makes him a very popular figure right out of the chute when he enters office. Now, the second, I would like to show you this, but because of time, I'm going to skip over this. This is a film that, if anybody wants to see it later, I'll show it to you, but it's really very interesting. Comes from it's an old television show that relates to this chaplaincy thing, but for time's sake, I'm going to skip over it and go to the second controversy, which some of you may find hard to believe. I'm going to now tell you about it, and then I'm going to ask how many of you really have ever heard of this before. Have any of you ever heard of what's called General Grant's Orders Number 11? If you have, put your hand up. Okay, there's only a few, and that's typical. That's not unusual. Most people, in fact, find what I'm about to say incredible. But you can go and check me out. In fact, you should, because at times I do exaggerate. But in this case, what this is about, in December of 1862, December the 17th to be exact, General Grant issues an order because he is frustrated that profiteers are going into the South, purchasing cotton, and then bringing it up to the North and selling it for a profit. And so he is in charge, Grant is, of what's called the Military Department of Tennessee, which includes 4 big states. And he issues a general order, which is sent by telegram to every place in his command. And as you can see for yourself, the order, this is a copy from the National Archives. The order says, I'll blow up the main phrase so you can see it clearly. He says, the Jews as a class, having violated every regulation of trade established by the department, the Treasury Department, and the department orders, are hereby expelled from the military department. And they are to leave in 24 hours. Now, the consequence of this, my friends, is really very grave. This is the only time in all of recorded American history that Jews were expelled from American territory. And fortunately, for reasons I won't go into right now, I'll answer questions if there's time, but most of the Jews never really were forced to leave, and I can explain why. But in a few select places, they were actually thrown out. And one of those places was Paducah, Kentucky. There were 32 or 33 Jews living in Paducah, Kentucky. These were not profiteers. They were not buying up cotton. They had stores and so forth. There were women, men, children. And the day after the order arrives, the provost marshal in that region walks into the town and he presents expulsion orders to everyone in that city. And one of those people is this man, Caesar Caskell, one of the great heroes of American Jewish history. Mr. Caskell is a Bavarian Jewish immigrant. He makes his living by selling products in a store in Paducah, Kentucky. He probably spoke with a very thick accent. and the provost marshal's people come to his door and throw him out. He's put on a boat. He's sent up to Cincinnati, Ohio, and he is hopping mad. And he calls this the grossest violation of the U.S. Constitution in its history. He goes to the famous rabbi in Cincinnati by the name of Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder of the school where I teach and where Rabbi Cohn studied. And he tells him about what happened. And Rabbi Wise says, that's impossible. So he shows him his expulsion order. And Rabbi Wise says to him, my boy, don't you worry a thing about this. I'm going to bring this to B'nai B'rith, the fraternal organization. We're going to have a national protest. But Mr. Caskell is very upset, and he gets on a train, and then he gets in buggies, and in 2 weeks he's in Washington, D.C. on January the 3rd, 1863. With the help of a congressman, he gets in to see Abraham Lincoln at 8 o'clock at night in the White House. Now, if you think I'm making this up, you have good reason to think so, because it's an unbelievable story. And according to the tale that his brother told, that is Mr. Caskell, when he presents his expulsion order to the president looks at it and he says, this cannot be possible. And so he shows him his expulsion order, and then Lincoln, of course, with his famous sense of humor, says, well, I'm given now to understand that the children of Israel have been expelled from the happy land of Canaan. And then Caskell says, I responded and I said, that is correct, Mr. President, which is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom for protection. And that protection you will have is what Lincoln said to him, and then he gives to the congressman and to the gentleman a revocation order, and he says, tomorrow morning, go see General Halleck, that's the general-in-chief, and he says, I've ordered him to revoke that order. Is this all malarkey? Well, you're looking at a document. This is a telegram that was sent from a very prominent Jewish citizen of Washington, D.C. to the president of B'nai B'rith in St. Louis. The man who sends the letter, as you can see at the bottom, is a man by the name of Adolphus Solomons, and I'll blow up the most important part of the telegram for you to see clearly. He says, that is, Solomons is talking, he says, I have just seen General Halleck, who revoked General Grant's vile order on the 4th, the day it was received here. And that is exactly how Caskell tells the story. He arrived the evening of the 3rd. Lincoln revokes it, gives him an order, and says, tomorrow, present this to Halleck. And Halleck does, in fact, revoke the order. This revocation takes place so quickly that most people never heard that this had actually happened. But what it does do, again, is it makes Lincoln a gargantuan hero in the Jewish press. For again and again, it's repeated, the story is told, what he did and how he did it, and Lincoln becomes lionized as a result of it. Finally, the third issue that arises towards the end of Lincoln's presidency has to do with the NRA. That's not the National Rifle Association, friends. That's called the National Reform Association. It's a group of religious conservative leaders who began to feel that the reason that the Union was not able to win the war as it should have quickly and dramatically is because God was not written into the Constitution, that the American government was secularized, that there was a separation of church and state. And they come to Lincoln, this organized group called the National Reform Association. They come and meet with him in the White House in February of 1864, and they ask him to support their effort to alter the Constitution. They want to have a constitutional convention or send it out to all the states in order to revise the Constitution. The preamble would read, if they were able to have their way, as it reads in front of you this evening. We have the minutes of that meeting because the NRA published those a few years after Lincoln's death. And it's their story of what Lincoln said at that meeting. And what Lincoln said, according to them, is that he's sympathetic to them, that he understands what it is that they want, and that he's their friend. However, he says to them, we have a war, and to try to distract the government from winning the war, to send out into the states constitutional petitions or to create a constitutional convention, all of these ideas would distract from the victory. So wouldn't they let him would lead the country knowing that Lincoln has sympathy for what they're trying to accomplish? Now, at first, in the papers, you read how nervous the Jews were that the Constitution might actually be changed and that Lincoln might have been persuaded by these people. But as time goes on and we get closer to Lincoln's death, we see in the Jewish press they're pointing out two things again and again, that Lincoln never mentions this topic. He never discusses it. It's never mentioned. He uses no rhetoric to refer to this idea. And in addition to that, they noticed, the Jews, that Lincoln's rhetoric itself becomes more universal. As time goes on, he seems to have more of an awareness, as he gets older, of inclusivity, what we would call inclusivity, in comparison to how he begins. An example would be if you look at his first inaugural speech, he's trying to appeal to the South, not to fight with the North. And he says, why should we fight? Are we not all Christians? But then 4 years later, when he's inaugurated again, the speech he gives has been called almost a sermon, and he quotes almost exclusively in that second inaugural address from the Hebrew Scriptures. So this is at least the way Jews perceive it. Now, for all these three reasons, Lincoln is transformed, even while he lives, into a protector of the Constitution, and he has, if you will, for this little Jewish minority, the same adoration that will come from the African Americans who will look to him as the great emancipator. Now, there's one person I'd like to tell you about. I'm not going to have time because I have to wrap up, but if you want to read about this man, you'll find him very interesting. This was President Lincoln's podiatrist, his foot doctor, Dr. Issachar Zachary. Yes, he had a Jewish foot doctor, and if you don't believe me, take a look at Lincoln's reference for Dr. Zachary. He did a good job on Lincoln's feet, but don't think for a minute that all this man was doing was trimming Lincoln's toenails, because this man was a remarkable figure. I have a whole chapter on him. Without question, he wins Lincoln's confidence. Lincoln is convinced he's a man of intelligence and political skill, and Lincoln sends this foot doctor down to New Orleans to work with the Jewish community in New Orleans to try to encourage the reintegration of the New Orleans community, which had been conquered early in the war by the Union, into the Union mentality. And he's so successful, believe it or not, he says to Lincoln and to Seward, we have all these letters, he says, you know, if you give me a chance, Zachary says, I think I could get a meeting with Judah Benjamin. And I bet the two of us could negotiate an end to this war. Now, if you don't know who Judah Benjamin is, Judah Benjamin was a very prominent member of the cabinet for the Confederacy, the only Jew in the what you call either the cabinet of the North or the South. In fact, he's the only Jew whose face appears on any kind of coin in American history, and that is on the $2 Confederate bill. He was the Attorney General, the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of State for the Confederacy. He and Mr. Zachary actually do meet and apparently do negotiate a deal, and this deal is then brought to President Lincoln, and Lincoln then discards the idea, which he does repeatedly, that he considers negotiating the war to an end, and then he decides he won't do that. So, friends, it's time to wrap up. You've been listening a long time, and I want to now just end by pointing how did we get from there to here, where Lincoln is such a remarkable hero to so many American Jews. Now, Lincoln is a hero to everybody, and all peoples seem to identify with Lincoln. But my point in the book is that for most people, just being fascinated with Lincoln, his remarkable character, is enough. But for American Jewry, for some reason, that's just not enough. Lincoln has to become one of them. And so what you find is that during the period right after Lincoln's shocking murder, which takes place on the 14th, well, he is shot on the 14th and he passes away on the morning of the 15th, we find that during his funeral, which is one of the longest and most elaborate funerals in all of American history, many, many eulogies are given in churches and synagogues all over America. And most of these great eulogies have been preserved. And I began to read the eulogies in great number. There's probably close to 50 or 60 of them that have survived from all over the country, the North and even in the South, about Abraham Lincoln from the Jewish perspective. And I began to see it was so clear that already at the moment of his death, he is being Judaized. So let me give you some examples of what happens. You're looking at a picture of Rabbi Benjamin Zola. He was a rabbi in Baltimore. He delivered these words in German, but I've translated them for you. He says to his congregation when he's delivering Lincoln's funeral address, he says, "Even while Lincoln was not flesh of our flesh, he was spirit of our spirit and essence of our essence. His soul, his heart, his entire nature are all truly Judaic and truly Jewish in spirit." Then in Cincinnati, Ohio, this man, Rabbi Max Lilienthal, is given a note in the middle of Sabbath services. He bursts into tears and cries on the pulpit. And when he pulls himself together, he can only think to quote from the Hebrew Bible, and he recites, as you can see, these remarkable words, "A great man in Israel has fallen." But the most dramatic example of what I'm just giving you the taste of right now comes from that same man who was the founder of the school where Rabbi Cohn studied, where I studied, where many rabbis who are in this room studied in Cincinnati, the founder of our school, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, never to be outdone. Wise is the top banana of all the rabbis. He probably is the single most influential source for why people are convinced Lincoln actually was Jewish, because he tells his congregation on this occasion the following words. He speaks, he says, "Brethren, the lamented Abraham Lincoln believed himself to be bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh. He supposed himself to be a descendant of Hebrew parentage. He said so in my presence. And indeed, he preserved numerous features of the Hebrew race, both in countenance and in character." Now, I've always thought that was ridiculous since, of course, as we know, Lincoln never had red hair. So, the most, of course, remarkable, inspirational for me illustration of what I'm now pointing out comes from a document that became the title of my book. And it proves, documentary proof, that there were at least some American Jews, while Lincoln was yet alive, who viewed him as one of their own. Listen carefully now to the words that were delivered at the eulogy of Lincoln in Louisville, Kentucky in 1865. These words weren't that hard to find. They were published in the Louisville Daily Journal on the front page, and when I got the copy of it, I just read it from the beginning, and I must say I almost fell off my chair. But this is what Louis Naphtali Dembitz, by the way, if that name Dembitz sounds familiar to anybody in the room, that's you're thinking of Louis Dembitz Brandeis, the first Jew to sit on the United States Supreme Court, and this is his uncle. And Louis Brandeis loved and admired his uncle from Louisville so much for being a scholar and a political activist and a caring human being in so many ways that he took his last name and made it his own middle name, even while his uncle was alive. And Dembitz says these words to the Jews of Louisville. He says, "Friends, you often called him jocosely." That's a $25 word for humorously. You often called him Rabbi Abraham, as if he were one of our nation, as if he was of the seed of Israel. But in truth, you might have called him Abraham, the child of our father Abraham. For indeed, of all the Israelites throughout the United States, there is none who is more fitted to the true ideal of what a descendant of Abraham ought to be than Abraham Lincoln. So, friends, from this remarkable document, I think it is fair to say, from primary source material, that even while most Americans were referring to Lincoln as Father Abraham, it seems clear to me that I've proven that at least the Jews of Louisville, and I would say perhaps others, had already begun while he was alive to crown President Lincoln with the title that is often considered the most regal title can be given to any Jew, and that is the title of Rabbi. Now, the rest of my book brings us to the contemporary part of this address, and that is that over 150 years, I tried to show from this moment up until the movie that I mentioned at the beginning, that Lincoln becomes part of the warp and woof of American Jewish legacy, that Jews not only respect him and admire him, but they continue to use him and to adopt him and to make him one of their own. In my book, I show something phenomenal. I show that actually textbooks in religious school, I'm talking about for the synagogue, actually use Abraham Lincoln as a model for how to be a good Jew. That the names that immigrants give to their children when they become American will be Abraham Lincoln Merowitz, Abraham Lincoln Yankovitz, Abraham Lincoln, and it goes on, that he becomes an Americanizing agent. In World War I, he becomes the image of the fight for democracy and the fights for freedom from the Jewish point of view, and on and on and on, up until the last chapter is where I focus on the movie and why it is. So Lincoln has, if you will, a unique status. I refer to him as the only non-Jewish Jewish icon. And if you think about it, Jews, like everyone else, admire our great heroes of American history, of course. Washington, Jefferson, and more recently Roosevelt and Kennedy, always. But of all these names that you would mention, none of these are made into Jews. Only Lincoln is the only non-Jewish Jewish icon. So I conclude with the point that no matter how beloved or revered any American non-Jew may be by the American community, there is no one who's ever matched the enduring legacy among American Jews who refuse to accept anything other than the idea that, as one rabbi put it in a eulogy for Lincoln, quoting from the book of Genesis, I'll say it in the original Hebrew, he said, Hu haya ke'echad mimenu, which in Hebrew would mean, Lincoln, he was just like one of us. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
I think well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Zola. That was a fascinating talk, and this is why universities are here, to bring information like this to us. So I really appreciate it. And we're not saying goodbye yet. I think we might have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions if folks have questions. And if you don't, we can make some up. But
Well, I don't know if I would say shocked me. There were a couple of things. One of the things that I didn't talk about is that Lincoln had a wicked sense of humor, and sometimes he would make ethnic jokes. And he made ethnic jokes about all sorts of people, including Jews. And so that was very interesting to see that. Other things that surprised me was there's a story about, some of you may have read that the day he's assassinated, Lincoln and Mary Todd in the afternoon are taking a ride in a carriage, and according to a undocumented exchange, Lincoln says to her, you know, once we finish this second term, I think I'd like to go and visit Jerusalem. You know, these are part of the lore of Lincoln. One of the other interesting things that I learned, and maybe some of you who are coin collectors already know this, but the image on my book, which you may think is the Lincoln penny of Lincoln's head, I didn't know anything. I mean, I think all of us have Lincoln pennies in our pocket, right? And probably knew just by experience that that's figure on Lincoln's face has been on that coin a long time. In fact, I'm told it's the oldest continuous visage on any American coin. It was first put on that coin in 1909 to honor Lincoln's 100th birthday. What I didn't know is that the numismatic who made that coin was a Eastern European Jewish immigrant. And this is all documented in my book. In 1904, a Jew by the name of Victor David Brenner, an immigrant, is a numismatic, and he's chosen to make an image of Theodore Roosevelt for the Panama Medal. So he's at the White House, and he's talking to President Roosevelt, and Roosevelt says to him, you know, I see you're making this medal for me, and we're going to hire someone because in 1909, Roosevelt admired Lincoln, wants to make a big wants to honor Lincoln by putting his image on a coin of some sort. So this immigrant says, well, you know, I happen to have a relief of Lincoln that I made. So it's not the coin. He actually had a square item that still exists of Lincoln's relief. And he brings it in and shows it to Roosevelt. And Roosevelt immediately initiates the effort to make this man's image the image that will appear on the coin. And some of you who are coin collectors may even know that there was a controversy about this because when the coin first appeared, it appeared with Mr. Brenner's initials on the bottom, VDB. And there was a huge din and cry about this, even though such things had happened. Congressmen were upset, and the coin had to be reissued immediately without his initials, which of course for coin collectors has now made many coin collectors very happy, because if you can find the VDB, you have something worth much more than a penny. But all of these things were very astonishing to me about Lincoln. He was really a remarkable figure. Yes, sir. Yes.
And in fact, in Odessa, where I was growing up, it was pretty much a common knowledge. So the issue of Lincoln Brigade.
Yes, the Lincoln Brigade.
Very much a part of our Soviet history, was also coincidentally perceived as a Jewish.
Yes, and I do talk in my book about Lincoln Brigade. We will end. Your story is a good way for us to conclude. If there's time for a few more questions, but I want to tell a story that I think addresses your point and your point, and it would be a great story to end with that you just made me think of when you talked about Odessa and what your mom thought and so forth. You hear this all the time. And in fact, if you want to get yourself in trouble with certain Jews, just try to tell them that he really was. Go online, students, go online this evening and type in Lincoln Jew. And you will find all sorts of websites that are set to, they're going to prove that Lincoln is, no matter what Zola says, Lincoln is Jewish. In fact, just before I came here, on the plane today, I'm reading, it sounds cuckoo, but some guy who was raised as a Mennonite. And he sent me a packet this thick to prove that there's a Mennonite Jewish connection to two sides of the family, and there, without question, he's convinced that Lincoln was of Jewish descent. So this goes on and on. Now, I'm not saying it's completely, I can, lay down my life that he didn't have some Jewish ancestors or so forth, but there's really no way of knowing because we don't have the data and the information to be able to validate or verify that he really was born legally of a Jewish mother, Jewish grandmother, mother, and so forth. It just can't be proven, but that won't stop people from, insisting that that's the case. But anyway, yes, sir, please.
The audience doesn't seem to be aware that in nearby Redlands, not far from the temple, is the only Lincoln Museum west of the Mississippi. The Lincoln Memorial Shrine, right behind the Smiley Library in downtown Redlands.
Well, I haven't visited. I wish I were going to be able to see it. I'll have to come back sometime to see it. I would like to. The other amazing thing, to answer your question is how much continues to turn up about Lincoln after all these years. Because, of course, there was no library in those days. There was no sense of collecting the way we do today, which gives me an opportunity to put in a plug for the American Jewish Archives. If we don't save our documents, we can't write history. So it's very important to base your history on facts. But in those days, after the shock of Lincoln was the first person assassinated to hold that office, and everything went in every direction. And so it still to this day, we're finding documents. Any other questions? If there aren't, my teacher, Dr. Marcus, you heard a story at the beginning, which was so typically of Dr. Marcus about nothing is more repugnant than a skinny old man. And so I do remember, and I'm sure you will too, Rabbi Cohn, that Dr. Marcus was famous for saying to students, he would say, remember, when you go out to talk, he would say, the mind can absorb only as much as the tushy can endure. So I'll end with this story, which I think you'll all enjoy. That your story about your mother made me think of. This story was told to Ferguson. Remember Ferguson at the very beginning? And this story was told to Ferguson when he went to visit the Springfield Museum. He stayed at the Hilton, or the Marriott, I can't remember which one, in Springfield, and he was there to visit the tomb, and he says that the hotel manager walked up to him and was talking to him and asked him what he was doing, and he said he was here to write about Lincoln, and he told him this story, the hotel manager, and he documents this in the book. He says that the hotel manager told him that about a month ago, so this would have been in 2004, 2003, who knows, a very elderly man appears at the hotel, and he has Parkinson's disease. And so he's very infirm, and he walks with a walker, and he's all by himself. And they're very nervous at the hotel because he looks like he's going to topple over any minute. And in the morning that he's there, he approaches the manager and says, what would the best way for me to get to the Lincoln tomb? So the manager says, you want to go to the Lincoln tomb? Let me take you to the Lincoln tomb. So he gets his car, puts this elderly man into the car, and takes him to the Lincoln tomb. And he says he's so nervous about this man's physical being that he escorts him. For those of you who visited, you have to walk in a door, and it's like little tunnels before you get to the little place where, supposedly Lincoln is buried, even though he's not buried where you see him. And he says that the man stands there and begins to weep and to cry. And the manager stands with him, and then when he's done, he says, thank you. He says, we can go back to the hotel now. And so they get him in the car, and he's driving back to the hotel, and curiosity apparently gets the best of the hotel manager, and he says to this elderly man, you know, I couldn't help but notice you were so very emotional. Is there a reason that you were so emotional? And the elderly man then rolls up his sleeve and shows him the tattoo from the concentration camp. And he proceeds to tell this story to the hotel manager, who repeats it to Ferguson. He says, I was a young boy when this was put on my arm, and I was taken away from my parents, and I was all alone, and I was scared, and I didn't think I could survive. And he says, alone in the camp, I would think to myself about Abraham Lincoln. And then he says, one night, Abraham Lincoln came to me in a dream. And he said to me these words, no man is better than any other man. And one day you will be free, and you must live your life in accordance with the principles that I'm telling you this now, and never give up hope that the world can be a better place. And he says that vision is why I survived, and now I'm sick and old, and I wanted to come and thank the president. And that is a story that does appear in Ferguson's book, and I would say that if there's one inspiring story above all of them, I don't know, perhaps it's been augmented, perhaps it's been aggrandized, but your story, I think, about your mother does validate this idea that there was something greater about Lincoln than anybody else, and that enables the thought of Lincoln, the idea of Lincoln, to help us to rise above the mundane. Thank you all so very much.
Once again, Dr. Zola, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. It was a wonderful talk, and thank you all for coming out. And please drive safely when you go home. I don't know what the weather's like, but it's supposed to be raining. So take care and good night.